What would you do if someone you treated with cruelty turned out to be your greatest judge? It's a question we rarely stop to consider, but for one man, the answer came crashing down in the most unexpected way. It was a quiet afternoon when Mr. Gerald Jerry Carter, a retired veteran in his 70s, walked into a small-town cafe. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted a simple cup of coffee and a moment of peace. But little did the cafe owner know, his actions that day would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Not just for himself, but for everyone watching. So buckle up, because this story is about to take you on a journey of arrogance, humiliation, and the undeniable power of doing what's right. Grab your favorite drink, sit back, and let's dive in. Mr. Gerald Jerry Carter was the kind of man who carried dignity in his every step. A black man in his 70s, Jerry's life had been anything but easy. His broad shoulders bore the weight of a history that many would rather forget. But his face, weathered by time and the sun of countless battlefields, spoke of a resilience that could not be broken. Today, like many others, he wore his veteran's jacket. Its faded green fabric was adorned with medals and patches, each one a story of courage, sacrifice, and service to a country that had not always loved him back. Jerry had served in Vietnam, seen his friends fall beside him, and yet, through it all, he held on to his love for the values his country stood for, even when those values weren't returned to him. He was a widower now. His wife, Margaret, had passed away years ago, leaving behind a house filled with memories and a quiet ache in his heart. Jerry found comfort in the small things, reading the newspaper, tending to the flowers Margaret had loved, and stopping by the local cafe for a cup of coffee. Jerry's thoughts were quiet as he walked down the sunlit street that day, his steps steady but measured. As he reached the cafe, he paused to take in the scene. A quaint little spot on the outskirts of a Midwestern town, it had the charm of a place where time moved just a bit slower. Inside, the hum of conversation filled the air. People chatted over steaming cups of coffee, their laughter mingling with the occasional clatter of cups and plates. The chalkboard menu hung above the counter, listing the day's specials in neat handwriting. The faint aroma of fresh pastries lingered, mixing with the earthy scent of freshly ground coffee beans. Jerry opened the door, and the soft chime of the bell above announced his arrival. He stepped in, his eyes scanning the room. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other. Heads turned briefly to acknowledge him before resuming their conversations. But not everyone looked away. Behind the counter stood Rick Walters, the cafe owner. Stocky, middle-aged, and wearing a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face, Rick's eyes narrowed as they landed on Jerry. Jerry walked up to the counter, his movements slow but deliberate. He adjusted his jacket, a gesture of pride and respect for the life he had lived, and glanced at the menu. As he read the list of offerings, his mind wandered briefly, reflecting on the countless places he had visited, the faces he had seen, and the battles he had fought. In that moment, Jerry wasn't just a man ordering coffee. He was a symbol of resilience, of a history filled with struggle and survival. But as he stood there, lost in thought, the quiet hostility brewing behind the counter was about to explode into something far uglier than anyone in the cafe could have imagined. Jerry approached the counter, his worn boots making soft thuds on the hardwood floor. His eyes lingered on the pastries displayed in a glass case before shifting to the menu overhead. He decided on something simple, just a coffee and a sandwich. It wasn't much, but for him, it was more about the routine, the solace found in the mundane. Rick Walters stood behind the counter with an air of authority that felt more oppressive than welcoming. He was a stout man in his late 40s, with a demeanor that screamed impatience and entitlement. As Jerry placed his order, Rick didn't move to write it down. Instead, his eyes scanned Jerry from head to toe, the corners of his mouth curling downward in disdain. When Rick finally spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the warm hum of the cafe like a knife. "We don't serve people like you here." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The cheerful chatter of the other patrons dulled, and the soft clinking of cups and plates faded into the background. Jerry blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. His hand rested lightly on the counter, steady despite the quiet storm brewing inside him. Jerry stood still for a moment, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside him. The words, "We don't serve people like you," echoed in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd heard them, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. But today, standing in this small-town cafe with the smell of coffee and pastries in the air, it felt heavier, like a slap to everything he had ever stood for. Rick leaned on the counter, his scowl deepening as if daring Jerry to argue. The room was thick with tension. Every patron in the cafe had gone quiet, their conversations and laughter silenced as they pretended not to notice what was happening. But their glances, their whispers, those told the story of a room divided. Jerry, still standing at the counter, inhaled deeply. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady, each word deliberate and clear. "All I asked for was a coffee and a sandwich, nothing more, nothing less." Rick folded his arms across his chest, the smug look on his face revealing he was enjoying the control he thought he had. "And I told you, we don't serve your kind here. Now are you deaf or just plain stubborn?" Jerry's jaw tightened. He wanted to say more, but he knew that responding with anger would only feed the stereotype Rick was clinging to. Instead, he glanced around the room. The faces staring back at him told a story of silent complicity, some guilty, some indifferent, and a few showing hints of quiet sympathy. By the window, a woman in her 30s lowered her cup and looked away when Jerry's eyes met hers. Across the room, a young couple whispered, their expressions uneasy, but their voices too low to carry. At a table near the counter, a man in a business suit shuffled uncomfortably, fidgeting with his phone as though he wanted to record but wasn't quite brave enough to hit the button. The silence was broken by the faint rustling of paper. Emily, the young waitress, had stepped forward slightly, holding a notepad in trembling hands. She was looking at Jerry now, her face pale and unsure. For a moment, it seemed as if she might take his order, defying Rick's unspoken rule. But before she could speak, Rick snapped his fingers at her, the sound sharp and commanding. "Emily, don't you even think about it," he growled, his voice dripping with authority. "You know the rules." Emily froze, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between Jerry and Rick, her internal conflict visible to anyone paying attention. Jerry gave her a small, reassuring nod, silently telling her it was okay, that he didn't blame her. "Rules," Jerry repeated softly as though tasting the word. He turned back to Rick, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet strength. "You say there are rules, but tell me, who made those rules? And why do they only seem to apply to people who look like me?" Rick scoffed, his tone mocking. "Don't get philosophical on me, old man. This is my place, and I say who gets served and who doesn't. Now, unless you want me to call the cops, I suggest you take your little speech and head on out." The mention of the cops made Jerry pause. He'd seen how those situations often ended, especially for men like him, but he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he retrieved a crisp $10 bill and placed it on the counter with a deliberate motion. "Coffee and a sandwich," he said again, his voice unwavering. "I've already paid. Now, are you going to do your job, or are you going to keep proving to everyone here what kind of man you are?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The tension was almost unbearable now, a palpable force that pressed down on everyone present. Rick's face reddened with anger, and for a moment it looked as though he might lash out. But instead, he slapped the $10 back onto the counter and growled, "Get out before I throw you out." Jerry didn't flinch. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes locked on Rick's, his presence alone challenging the man's hate without saying a word. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, a voice broke the silence. It was soft, hesitant, but clear enough to carry across the room. "You shouldn't have done that." Jerry turned his head slightly, catching the young waitress's gaze. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice trembling with the weight of the words she had just spoken. Rick whirled on her, his face contorted with fury. "What did you just say?" The cafe erupted into murmurs as the tension shifted. Patrons exchanged glances, their unease growing. Jerry, standing by the door, gave Emily one last look. He offered her a faint smile, a silent thank you, before stepping outside and letting the door close softly behind him. Jerry turned back to Rick, his expression calm but laced with quiet strength. He refused to let the man's hatred dictate his next move. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, steady. "What do you mean? People like me?" The cafe fell silent again. All eyes turned to Rick, whose sneer only grew deeper. He leaned on the counter, his posture dripping with arrogance. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "This place isn't for you. Move along." Jerry's hands rested lightly on the counter, though a faint tremor betrayed the emotions surging within him. He clenched his jaw briefly before replying, his voice unwavering despite the insult. "I've served this country longer than you've been alive," he said, his tone low but deliberate. "All I want is a cup of coffee. Is that too much to ask?" Rick rolled his eyes, as though Jerry's words were nothing more than an inconvenience. His voice rose slightly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear him. "I don't care who you served or what you think you're owed. Get out." Jerry stood tall, his gaze fixed on Rick. For a moment, the weight of his years of service, his sacrifices, and his dignity all hung in the air between them. He spoke again, quieter this time, but with an edge of finality. "Men like you will never understand respect, but you will learn, one way or another." Rick slammed his hand down on the counter, the sound jolting some of the patrons from their seats. "I said, get out!" The silence that followed was suffocating. Jerry stared at Rick for a long moment before turning on his heel and walking toward the door. He moved slowly, deliberately, his steps echoing against the wooden floor. He paused briefly at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder, but he said nothing more. Outside, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the small town square. Jerry crossed the street and sat on a weathered wooden bench beneath a large oak tree. He removed his veteran's cap and held it in his hands, running his fingers over the fabric as if drawing strength from it. His gaze drifted to the cafe's entrance, where the faint chatter of patrons continued as though nothing significant had happened. He sighed deeply, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "This isn't new," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with wariness, "but it never gets easier." Jerry's thoughts drifted to the battles he'd fought, not just overseas but here at home. The stares, the whispers, the blatant discrimination, it had all been part of his life for as long as he could remember. He thought of his wife, Margaret, and how she'd always been his anchor, the one who reminded him to keep going, no matter how hard it got. "I wish you were here," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "You'd know what to say." Across the cafe, in a corner booth by the window, sat a woman who had witnessed everything. Rachel Hayes was not someone you would immediately notice. Her presence was subtle, quiet. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and slacks, her demeanor exuded confidence without ostentation. Her brown leather satchel rested neatly on the seat beside her, a steaming cup of coffee on the table in front of her. Rachel wasn't here for leisure. She was in town for a legal conference and had stopped by the cafe to finish reviewing a few case files. But the moment Jerry walked in, her attention had shifted entirely. She'd caught the way Rick's eyes narrowed the second Jerry stepped up to the counter. She recognized the tone in Rick's voice, sharp, condescending, and unmistakably prejudiced. As the confrontation unfolded, Rachel's grip on her coffee cup tightened. Her sharp, observant eyes darted between Jerry, Rick, and the patrons around them. She noted the silence of the room, the way most people avoided looking at Jerry, and the young waitress Emily, visibly caught between fear and conscience. Rachel's pulse quickened as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She set it discreetly on the table, the camera angled toward the counter. She pressed record. "This is why I do what I do," she thought, her jaw tightening. "Because people like Rick think they can get away with this." As Jerry exited the cafe, Rachel's gaze followed him through the window. She watched him pause on the bench across the street, the weight of his humiliation etched into his posture. She could see him take off his cap and stare at it, lost in thought. Rachel leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Jerry or Rick. This was about the systemic rot that allowed moments like this to happen in the first place. Rachel's thoughts drifted to her grandfather, Henry Hayes, a decorated World War II veteran who had faced similar discrimination. She could almost hear his voice as he recounted the stories of his return from the war, how he and his fellow black soldiers had fought for freedom overseas, only to come home and be denied service at restaurants, forced to use separate facilities, and treated as second-class citizens. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "Rachel, remember this. What they did to us wasn't just about ignorance. It was about power. And the only way to fight power like that is to stand up and speak out." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, letting those memories anchor her. She thought of the times her grandfather had been turned away from diners, how he'd been humiliated despite the medals he wore on his chest. She thought of the courage it must have taken for him to keep going, to keep believing in the ideals of a country that didn't always live up to them. Opening her eyes, Rachel looked around the cafe. The patrons were beginning to settle back into their conversations, the tension dissipating like steam from a coffee cup. But Rachel couldn't let it end there. "Not today," she thought, slipping her phone back into her bag and rising from her seat. "Not while I have the power to do something about it." She smoothed her blazer, adjusted the strap of her satchel, and made her way toward the counter, her heels clicking against the floor. Rick was leaning against the counter, trying to appear unbothered, but Rachel noticed the tension in his posture. He looked up as she approached, his brows furrowing slightly at her confident stride. Rachel stopped a few feet from the counter, her gaze unwavering as she addressed him. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice your interesting customer service policy. Care to explain?" The room grew quiet again, the chatter of the patrons ceasing as they turned their attention to the interaction. Rick straightened, his expression shifting into one of defensive arrogance. "This is my cafe," he said, his voice sharp. "I decide who I serve." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. "And what exactly do you base that decision on? The color of someone's skin?" Rick's eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, his stance defiant. "Look, lady, I don't have to explain myself to you. I run my business how I see fit." Rachel smirked, pulling a business card from the inner pocket of her blazer and placing it on the counter. Her voice was steady, every word deliberate. "You might want to reconsider that. I'm Rachel Hayes, civil rights attorney, and you just violated federal anti-discrimination laws." The silence that followed was deafening. Rick's face flushed, his confidence faltering as he glanced down at the card. Patrons began whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Rachel leaned in slightly, her tone remaining calm but laced with authority. "You see, refusing service based on race isn't just unethical, it's illegal. And thanks to modern technology, I have the entire incident recorded. So unless you'd like to explain yourself in front of a judge, I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to make this right." Rick's bravado crumbled. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the business card, reading the name and title printed on it. His gaze flickered around the room, noting the phones pointed in his direction, the patrons murmuring, the way his young waitress, Emily, was watching him with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. Look," Rick stammered, his voice losing its usual edge. "I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, I have my policies, you know? I didn't mean to offend anyone." Rachel's expression hardened. "Policies that single out people based on their race? That's not just offensive, it's illegal, and you're going to have to answer for it." Rick stepped back, his face pale. Sweat began to bead on his forehead as he realized the gravity of the situation. He looked to Emily for support, but the young waitress simply stared back at him, her eyes cold and unflinching. The patrons in the cafe were no longer whispering. They were openly discussing what they had witnessed, some voicing their disgust, others expressing shock. Rachel straightened, her presence commanding. "Here's how this is going to work," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "You're going to apologize to that man you just humiliated, and you're going to start treating every customer who walks through that door with the respect they deserve. If you don't, I'll make sure this incident becomes a case study in every legal ethics course in the country." Rick swallowed hard, his hands clenching the edge of the counter. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid, not just of Rachel, but of the consequences she was laying out before him. As Rick fumbled with Rachel's business card, the tension in the cafe thickened. Rachel's unwavering gaze didn't falter as she turned toward the door and gestured to Jerry, who still sat quietly on the bench across the street. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice firm yet inviting. "Please come back inside, I insist." Jerry looked up, surprised but curious. He hesitated for a moment, his veteran's cap still clutched in his hand, before rising slowly. The weight of the moment was evident in his deliberate steps as he crossed the street. Rick watched Jerry re-enter with a scowl that deepened with every second. His resentment was palpable, his posture stiff as Rachel addressed him directly. "You're going to serve this man. Right now," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Rick hesitated, his lips tightening into a thin line. But the murmurs of the other patrons, the phone still pointed in his direction, and the intensity of Rachel's glare forced his hand. He nodded reluctantly, muttering under his breath as he reached for a coffee cup. As Jerry took a seat at one of the tables, Rachel joined him, sitting across from him. Rick placed the coffee and a sandwich on the table with a clatter, his expression cold and resentful. Jerry, however, remained composed, nodding politely. "Thank you," Jerry said softly, his dignity unshaken. Rachel glanced around the room, her gaze sweeping over the patrons who were still watching. She stood up, her presence commanding as she addressed them directly. "Let's talk about what just happened here," she began. The room fell silent, every eye on her. Rachel's voice was clear and steady, carrying the weight of her conviction. "Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet policy, an unspoken rule, or a dismissive glance. But it's no less harmful. And when we see it happening, when we stand by and do nothing, we're complicit in it." She paused, letting her words sink in. Silence is complicity. If you see injustice and do nothing, you're part of the problem. Standing up against it isn't always easy, but it's necessary. Because moments like these aren't just about one person, they're about the kind of world we want to live in. The patrons exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. A few looked down at their coffee cups, visibly uncomfortable but thoughtful. Rachel turned to Jerry, her tone softening. "And to those who've lived with this every day of their lives, like Mr. Carter, I want to say this: your dignity, your courage, and your resilience matter. And people like Rick," she said, casting a pointed look at the cafe owner, "will have to answer for their actions." By the time Rachel and Jerry left the cafe, the incident had already begun to ripple beyond the confines of the small-town establishment. Videos recorded by patrons were uploaded to social media, Rachel's calm but powerful words spreading like wildfire. The story made headlines. Civil rights lawyer confronts racist cafe owner, a veteran's dignity restored. Public outrage followed swiftly. Social media platforms buzzed with calls for boycotts of Rick's Cafe. Comments poured in, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and praising Rachel for taking a stand. The cafe's business plummeted almost overnight. Regular patrons stopped coming, unwilling to associate with a place now synonymous with prejudice. Protesters gathered outside the cafe, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Hate has no home here." Rick's reputation was irreparably damaged. Attempts to defend himself only fueled the backlash, as his words were met with scorn and disbelief. The cafe, once a bustling hub of the town, became a symbol of the community's reckoning with its own prejudices. Later that day, as Rachel and Jerry sat in a quieter cafe a few blocks away, the conversation turned personal. Jerry cradled his coffee cup, his fingers tracing the rim as he spoke. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice low and reflective. "When I came back from the war, Korea, it was the same story. They sent us out there to fight, to risk our lives, but when we got home, nothing changed. Separate barracks, separate tables, separate everything. They called us heroes overseas, but here, we were just another problem to be ignored." Rachel listened intently, her heart aching as Jerry continued. "I remember one time I was in uniform, walking down the street, and a man spit on me, said I didn't deserve to wear it. I didn't say a word, just kept walking. But it stays with you, you know? The things they do, the things they say." He looked up at her then, his eyes tired but resolute. "I didn't stand up to that man, but I stood up today, and it felt different. It felt right, thanks to you." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her mind drifting to her grandfather once more. She could see his face, weathered but kind, his voice steady as he told her about the struggles he endured after returning from World War II. He used to say, "Rachel, the fight doesn't end just because the war does." And he was right. That's why I went into law, to fight the battles he couldn't, to stand up for people like him, like you, who gave everything and got nothing in return. She smiled softly at Jerry. My grandfather always told me, don't let them make you feel small. That's why I couldn't just sit there today. I couldn't let Rick get away with it. Jerry nodded, a hint of a smile on his face. You've got the same fire he must have had. Don't ever lose it. Rachel's resolve only deepened. She knew that moments like these were just small victories in a much larger fight. But they mattered. They always mattered. This brings me to the end of the story, but the message doesn't have to stop here. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories. Together, we can inspire change one story at a time. Thank you for watching.